Welcome to our virtual Justice on the Block Legal Information Clinic. With hurricane season right around the corner at the top of June, LSNF wanted to join other agencies and organizations around the state helping people get educated and prepared. We particularly want to highlight a topic that doesn't get much attention, the intersection of domestic violence and disasters. As natural disasters are increasing, worldwide research and anecdotal stories show that incidents of domestic violence increase substantially after a disaster. We have two presenters joining us this afternoon to elaborate on what factors contribute to the increase in domestic violence, what resources there are for victims, and what can be done to help stop the prevalence of domestic violence after a disaster. As always, this video does not create an attorney-client relationship or substitute legal advice you've been given in the past. You may have defenses that we haven't discussed here, so seeking out an attorney or legal help is always advisable.
Hi, I'm very excited to be doing this with Christine. So I will just introduce myself quickly and I'll let Christine then take it away and introduce herself. I'm Thomas Voracek. I'm a staff attorney with Legal Services of North Florida in the Quincy office. And I am funded under both mostly family law with domestic violence, but I do some disaster. So I've seen some of both ends of this.
Hi, I'm Christine Kelly. I'm an attorney at Lynchard Seely in Pace, Florida. I actually previously worked for Legal Services in North Florida, and I did quite a bit of disaster work after the floods in 2014 in Pensacola, and after the tornadoes in Century in Pensacola, and after Hurricane Sally. I've also done quite a bit of domestic violence work and have a good bit of experience with domestic violence, and it's a problem I wish were not as prevalent as it is.
Yeah, and Christine actually, as she said, she was in Pensacola. She just recently left us. We're sad to see her go, but we're excited to see what she does. So I think the first thing that we were going to talk about is just kind of the scope of what we're talking about and what is domestic violence and what is this issue that we're even talking about today at all. And as Rachel said at the beginning, we always see an increase in cases after any disaster, a hurricane, even with the pandemic, anything else that's going on. Those are the two big ones in Florida, but you see this nationwide, you see this worldwide. We saw this after Hurricane Michael a few years ago. Refuge House, which is one of the local shelters around here, saw an overcapacity right after the storm, almost a double increase in their bed capacity. Disasters are only increasing, unfortunately, in our world in the future. We've seen that both naturally and then with the pandemic. Between 2010 and 2015, there were actually 720 disasters declared where the states or Indian tribes requested or received federal funds. And those are just the declared major disasters from FEMA. And between 2005 and 2015, about 1.7 billion people were affected by disasters worldwide. About 1.4 trillion with a T dollars in damages were inflicted, and about over 7 million people unfortunately passed from disasters. And that's just between 2005 and 2015. So it's only going up.
So I'm going to talk about what we mean by domestic violence. And so, of course, everybody knows about people hitting each other and that being domestic violence. Most people probably also know about what sexual violence is, and those are the general things that people think of when they think about domestic violence. But domestic violence includes a lot more than physical violence and sexual violence and just hitting each other. It can include psychological abuse and oppression. It's often punctuated or further enforced by physical violence. It can include threatening the partner, friends, family, children, or pets, breaking the other partner's belongings, controlling money, controlling somebody's time, where you can go, who you can see, what you can do, controlling your actions. What the bottom line is, it's really about ways to control another person and what they do and who they go. There's lots of subtle ways that people abuse that you might not even think are abuse. Some people will try to egg somebody on until that person is beyond their limits so they can say, oh, that person's crazy. When they're not really acting in any way that a person who was pushed past their limits would act. When they get pushed past their limits, they've been pushed by that other person and pushed by that other person, and then that person gets to look like the calm one. A lot of times that'll happen with narcissists and other situations, but that's definitely also a subtle form of domestic violence that is also very problematic. Like I said, it's mostly about controlling another person. So domestic violence can happen between intimate partners. It can happen with exes, but it can also happen among family members or others living under the same roof. In Florida, the law says that you have to live together as a family unit, that it can be domestic violence. So that includes elder abuse. It can include abuse of children. And even though there is a separate category for child abuse, that doesn't mean that you cannot commit domestic violence against your child, whether a minor child or an adult child. It definitely happens.
Right. And I guess I would just add a couple of things that I've learned. I started pretty recently at this position. Previously, I was doing criminal work. But under Florida law, there's a few different types of injunctions you can get. So we're talking about domestic violence, but in the statute, there's also stalking, which doesn't have to be under the same roof. You don't have to be people that are all living under the same roof. There's stalking. Again, you don't have to be under the same roof for that. Both of those, I would say, and I think most people would agree, can and do often appear in domestic violence situations. And they're areas that the law is trying to recognize and trying to point out as different, and there are ways that we respond to this as a society. The other thing that I was trying to think about, or was going to mention, is just how wide these problems can be, and how some things that I'm sure Christine, you can talk about this too, but when we talk to clients, they'll say something that they don't think is that important, but then as an outsider, you're like, no, wait, let's talk about that for a second. I think for me and for many people in my office, we've heard about like abusing the pet or taking it out on the pet, or saying, well, the things with kids also, that, well, I'm not going to let you see your kid, or I'm going to take the kid. Threats like that somebody thinks, well, he's not hitting me, she's not assaulting me.
That's for sure true. People will, when you're talking to somebody that I've read notes and stuff, they're like, well, no, there's no domestic violence, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh, well, he just won't let me do this. And you think, wait, he's trying to control you. That's how it starts. Domestic violence, most people don't start in a relationship that turns into domestic violence. Your intimate partner doesn't come up and just punch you in the face the first time. That's not what happens. Because if that did happen, everybody would just leave. Nobody's going to go date somebody who's punching them in the face. It starts out with very subtle ways of controlling, and then it gets bigger and bigger. And really, essentially what happens is that the person will do whatever level of activity they need to do to control the other person. So it ramps up and ramps up and ramps up.
Yeah.
And that's part of why it's so dangerous when somebody tries to leave, because the other person will ramp up even more. Now I don't have control. This person's not in my house anymore. I have to get him back. I have to pull him back in. Now I have to do something super extreme. And so, yes, it starts in small ways that people don't even realize are domestic violence. And often it's kind of like the frog going in the water. The frog doesn't know the water's boiling because it gets hotter slowly until all of a sudden the frog's in boiling water.
Right. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, why does that, because we did say that disasters so often always result in this increase in cases. Why is that? Why does that happen? And looking at the research and thinking about what we've seen as attorneys and providers of services, I think pretty much everyone would agree it's you can boil it all down to stress. People are stressed. People are in a hard situation. They may have lost their jobs. They've lost their income. They're evacuating. They're going to some place that they don't know. They don't know when they're going to be able to go back home. They don't know what's even happening to their home necessarily. I've fortunately never had to sit through a hurricane. Christine, you may have, but I know I had to evacuate from Hurricane Irma, and I was down in Miami. Had no idea what Miami was going to look like when I got back. But luckily, I was able to leave. You know, there were people that weren't able to leave. Just a lack of resources. There are shortages. You don't have the cash. You don't have the ability to go out and get things. And just turmoil, just chaos and stress. Something Christine mentioned actually when we were talking about this presentation that I hadn't even thought of is just you're in a house and you can't leave. And I don't know, Christine, if you wanted to talk a little bit about that.
I just think when people are stuck with people, they start getting bored. It's particularly during hurricane season. That's in the summer. It's not a secret that when your house is overheated, it makes you get more angry. So your emotions are ramping up because you have nothing to do. You're bored. You probably can't use your phone because you can't charge it. So you need to keep it for emergencies. And you're hot and you're angry. And so the tensions just get thick more quickly. So it's just creating a situation where something can happen. And if you have somebody who wants to control the other person, and even people who aren't in domestic violence, they're probably going to quarrel more. It's just the way humans are in those situations. But if you have one person trying to control another person, then they're going to want to do it more. And like an observation I've had is that people act the most controlling towards other people when they feel like their own lives are out of control. And after a hurricane or after disaster, you don't have any control over any of that. You have no control over any of it. So it makes it harder. And then when you're stuck in there, you want to take it out on somebody and try to make it so you can put blame on somebody. I think it's just human nature that people want to try to feel better somehow and make it somebody else's fault so they can be mad at somebody rather than just accept that it's really not anybody's fault.
Right. And I mean, you mentioned that, you know, kind of that problems can ramp up, and we've seen that a lot where, you know, before the storm, there was definitely abuse. It gets worse after the storm, but there's also the phenomenon of there wasn't anything going on before, but now with all this stress and all this chaos and this uncertainty, something happens, and there's arguments, there's fights, there's quarrels. Somebody gets violent, unfortunately. We've all seen that, unfortunately. I think, you know, something that I've seen echoed in a lot of the literature, and Christine also talked about, is just the isolation, that your normal social networks aren't necessarily there. You know, you're stuck in the house alone with, you know, this other person or maybe a couple other people. You're not going to work. You're not going to the grocery store. You're not going to church. You're not going to school. You're not doing all of those normal daily living things that we all do when there's not a disaster going on. And that also means that people aren't seeing you. You know, they can't tell if you've got marks on you. You can't talk to them. Your phone's out, or, you know, you just don't see them. So you're not induced just by, you know, encountering each other on the street in such a way that, you know, maybe if Christine and I saw each other at the water cooler, we would say, oh, you know, we talk about stuff. Well, we're not going to work. We're not seeing each other. We're not talking. And just along with that isolation, the lack of broader societal support structures, law enforcement, the social services, the welfare agencies, the churches, the schools, all of those big institutions that we rely on, they're either out of commission or their resources are shifted to doing other things. Quite rightly. I mean, that I'm not faulting them for that, but resources get shifted around, and unfortunately, people fall through.
That's all very, very true. Sadly. So I'm going to talk. So what we see in the legal community, as Rachel said at the beginning, there's more injunctions applied for during disasters, more are violated. I can see one way that an injunction can get violated. Let's say two people who are separated because of an injunction, and one is in a place that's not very hurricane safe, and
or even homeless.
Yeah, or even homeless, and they say, hey, well, if I talk to my ex, even though he has this injunction against me, I can go live there and get through the storm. And they take the lesser of two evils and they go, and they shouldn't do that because it's going to probably end up bad. There's a reason they got the injunction in the first place. And that right there is a violation in itself, but then they're there, and then the big surprise, the abusive ex starts being abusive again. So there's also no addresses to reserve respondents when they're displaced. So when you get an injunction, you can get it temporary, but the court has to serve that on the person you're trying to get the injunction in for it to take place. So if they don't know how to find that person just roaming around, then that person can keep coming to your house. Now, when the other person's gone far away to, let's say the person went to California, maybe that's not as big of a deal at that time because that person's 3,000 miles away. They're probably not going to come after you. But if the person just hiding from the police and could come at any moment, that could be really scary because you can't ever get protected that way. See, there's also issues with time sharing and relocation. So one parent will believe the other parent's trying to take the children away. A lot of times parents will relocate without permission from the court. I mean, of course, if they want to go away for a week because of a storm, that's more acceptable than if they want to go across the country forever to go relocate with the children. There's more DCF involvement in investigations reports, which makes sense. If there's more domestic violence, children are going to be affected by that, whether directly through child abuse or indirectly through neglect or anything else. There's more dependency cases, which just what happens when DCF's getting involved more, there's going to be more cases open. There can be issues with immigration law. So there's foreign nationals of domestic violence can qualify for a U visa, and they may be able to become documented if they weren't, or at least extend the amount of time they can stay in the United States if they were here on a work or tourist visa. Another immigration law issue that I've seen in cases as abusers like to play on the ignorance of United States laws on their spouses that are here illegally and tell them, oh, I'm going to deport you. In some cases, especially if that spouse has a legal green card, the U.S. citizen spouse has no power to deport them, but the foreign spouse doesn't understand the laws and doesn't understand that. Maybe they don't really speak English, so they don't even know that they're protected. I've actually seen that a person had a visa that didn't expire for almost the entire 10-year period, and they were so afraid they were going to get deported. I was like, no, look at this date. You can't leave. You can't be kicked out before this date. You're legally in this country. Don't worry. But that's that's another way abusers can control people too.
Right. Sorry, we've also seen, and I think every attorney can talk about this who's even dabbled a little bit in immigration law. People that are not U.S. citizens and don't have an understanding of the immigration law, no matter what their status is, even if they would be perfectly safe, like you just talked about, Christine, they're reticent. They're afraid to go to the police. They're afraid to go to the courts. Sometimes reasonably, sometimes, as Christine was saying, not reasonably, but they don't want to call the court. They don't want to call the police because they're afraid that they're going to get deported. So they believe, it's just easier not to rock the boat.
I think part of that also comes from, some of them come from countries where the police are never helpful. And if you try to go to the government for help, like I've known people that came from other countries. So I know if you ever went to the police, you could just disappear one day and never be seen again. And if you came from a place like that here, of course you would be afraid to go talk to somebody. So like, there's so many factors that go into that an abuser can definitely play upon and use to their advantage to try to control the person. And then another thing that we see is that there's more trafficking of sex trafficking and labor trafficking. They both increase after hurricanes and other disasters. Traffickers bring in men and women to traffic to all of the disaster responders and laborers who are away from their families and hometowns, working lots of overtime and getting huge paychecks and lonely because they're away from their families. Also, there's more recruitment of locals after a hurricane and other disasters when traffickers exploit all those suddenly made jobless and homeless by the disaster to trick or recruit them into commercial sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And again, if that were to happen to foreign nationals, they could then qualify for a U visa. They couldn't get the T visa because they had to have been brought to the United States for the purpose of trafficking to get a T visa.
Right. I did want to underline all of these are issues that we see a lot, and they are all issues that are not just a short span of time right after the disaster. These can last for years, even a year or two after the disaster. I mean, we've seen it. The research backs it up. The injunction rate, the criminal filing rate for crimes that are related to domestic violence, they're all much higher for even years post-disaster. And the time-sharing relocations issues, those I see a lot of. I'm sure you've seen a lot of them too. That could even start, completely innocently. I've seen cases, I've had clients where, I lost my job because of this disaster. I need to move to find a job so I can support myself and my family. So they move and they take the kids with them. Well, unfortunately, you're under a parental and time-sharing order. You can't, in Florida, you cannot move further than 50 miles radius outside of that area without court permission. So you cannot just, as Christine said, go to California to get a job. Unfortunately, you have to ask the court for permission to do that. One of the other important things that we wanted to talk about was suggestions for the society and the wider stretch of society about what to do about this issue, not just pointing out things that are wrong, but trying to figure out how to better address these issues. So first we can talk about victims, survivors. What do you do? I think one of the biggest things is just develop a safety plan. And it doesn't have to be something formal, but just think about how you would prepare and how you are going to deal with a disaster. What are you going to do when the hurricane is coming and when the hurricane is here and after it's left to mitigate whatever the situation is that you're in? Think about a circle of support, friends, family, loved ones, anyone that you can reach out to, whether that's reaching out for material assistance, whether that's food, money, shelter. Can I stay with you instead of having to stay and shelter in place with my abusive partner? Or if it's just checking up on people, just having somebody that you can talk to and say, yes, I'm okay. No, nothing terrible has happened to me. Or something bad has happened to me and I need help, unfortunately. Avoiding isolation if it's possible. Unfortunately, oftentimes it's not possible. We talked about that before, about just being stuck in the house. But being in a wider community, being with other people really does help. Think about what past strategies you've used before to try to mitigate this, whatever that may be. Maybe it's that you have a safe community around you, or maybe it's that you reach out to people, and maybe it's that you focus on your work, or you focus on your children, so you try to avoid as much time as possible with your spouse or your partner or whoever it is, to try to just diffuse the situation and not get into something that could escalate. Devoting more time and methods and thinking about more methods of self-care, trying to be kind to yourself and to do things that you enjoy and that are going to make you feel better, because it's a stressful time just being in a storm. Being in an abusive situationship is also stressful. Combined, it's a lot, and you need to be able to take some time for yourself and take some time to recharge and recuperate. Remember that you are not at fault for anything that's happening to you. None of this is your fault for having violence directed at you. A lot of times that is another tactic of abuse itself, that, oh, well, you made me do it. No, you didn't. Violence is never acceptable. Violence is not the answer.
So what community members and loved ones can do, I mean, the first thing I think that I'm going to talk about applies not just in a disaster situation, but in any domestic violence situation. Remember when your friend or your family member, your sister, your brother, your daughter, your mother, whoever it is a victim of domestic violence, it's really, really, really hard to get out of those relationships. It's a cycle. The person's controlled. Part of that process of controlling is breaking down their self-esteem slowly. They may feel like they can't do anything by themselves. It could take them leaving 5, 6, 7, 8 times before they really leave for good. It's like quitting smoking. You know, it's going to take somebody a long time to quit smoking. It's going to take a really long time to leave that situation. So if you love that person, don't give up on them and don't be judgmental towards them. I feel like most people who are in that situation, they understand that their decisions are not the greatest decisions, but they don't know how to get out of it, or they're not mentally ready to get out of it. So be there for them and just care about them and let them know, I understand it's hard, but I'm here to help you, and keep helping them. Because eventually, if you keep helping them and don't give up on them, you may be the difference for them. But I mean, it's more specific disaster. Check in on your family members who might be at risk of domestic violence. Make sure they're okay. Open your home to them if you're at all able to. If they have a place to go that's your house, they maybe won't have to go to their abuser's house because they want to stay safe from a storm or a disaster. You could make up code words to communicate with them if something's wrong. Somebody might not be able to say, hey, come over here and get me because blah, blah, blah just punched me in the face. But they might be able to say to you, hey, I'm out of sugar. Can you bring me some? And if you know that that's what that means, then you can take the steps you need to help that person. And then be observant. If things change, notice it. Notice the signs that something might be wrong. Somebody's not returning your calls, or they're trying to end them quickly, or they sound like they've been crying, but they're saying everything's fine. There's lots of signs, especially if you've had a long relationship with somebody, like it's your daughter, your sister, somebody, your best friend that you've known for 25 years. You probably know when that person's okay and when that person's not okay better than anybody else, because you've had the time to know that person and understand the subtle signs that other people might not be able to see.
And finally, there's service providers, and that's a wide category of people. So, I mean, it includes attorneys like us, it includes law enforcement, it includes medical personnel, doctors, nurses, first responders, schools, libraries, really anyone who is trying to provide services and recovery. I think one of the things that's most important, it echoes something that Christine was saying about the family members and community members, is be cognizant and be observant, and most of all, believe when people talk about these issues. When somebody is presenting with a situation that looks like it might be domestic violence, or somebody even tells you, he's hitting me, or she's abusing the children, or whatever it is, ask more questions. Try to figure out what is going on. Don't just shut it down. And that is tough because, especially, normally service providers can often be burnt out because they're in high stress situations. It's a stressful job, but in a disaster, they're being called on to do so many other things. And there is a lot of burnout associated with that. But just believing somebody is so, so important. Not shutting them down. Especially being cognizant of the intersections of domestic violence and disaster and different population groups and identities that people have. A lot of what we're talking about here, and how a disaster only exacerbates all of these issues. And finally, just developing connections with other organizations, with other resources that are out there in the community that would be able to provide services to people. That is something that we at LSNF do. We are constantly trying to find and update our resource map so that we can tell people, okay, we're a legal services provider, but maybe you can go here to get this sort of help, or this organization is offering this sort of outreach. In a disaster, that becomes difficult just because people are kind of spread to the four corners of the earth, and there's not as much communication just because power lines are down, telephones are down, different logistical problems like that. But we've seen in the wake of disasters, these networks reform in different ways. So I remember hearing about, after Hurricane Michael, there was a radio station in Panama City that just would be broadcasting all the time. It was 24/7, and they would have periodic announcements from the community when somebody would have some tip of, the Methodist church on this street is offering, food or blankets or whatever it is, or, you can go to the library to get help with filling out benefits or getting documents, or, whatever the resource is. It's great to, before the disaster happens, try to make those connections and try to have that Rolodex in your head of, these are the people, these are the places that I can reach out to. We talk about in disaster recovery that, there's multiple phases to a disaster, and there's the preparation, there's the time when it's actually happening, and then there's the aftermath. And I think that has kind of been an underlying theme throughout this whole presentation from me and Christine of, what are you going to be doing before, what are you going to be doing during, and then what can you do after?
Yeah. I'd like to go back to what you just said, Thomas, about believing people. And I want to emphasize something about that. Abusers can be very charismatic and very good at appearing a certain way in the community. So then when somebody comes and tells you, well, this person's abusing me, a lot of times people will think, not blah, blah, blah. That person's great. They're the nicest person ever, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you take that approach and don't at least try to look into it, you're putting another layer of difficulty on that victim of getting actual help and getting out of that situation. Where if you take the time to listen to them and believe them, of course you can try to figure it out yourself. Of course, we all know there's a tiny fraction of people who are going to say things that aren't true, a tiny fraction. and you can make up a different decision. But if you take them seriously at first and try to help them through that situation and try to at least, you could just steer them in the direction to get help. You don't have to get in the middle of the situation. It can do so much to help somebody get out of that situation, just to feel like, oh, I don't have the entire world taking the side of my abuser because they think he or she is the best person in the world. Somebody cares about me.
Yeah. Right. And I think, I would also like to highlight, it's something we've come back to a few times, but, believing people when they come forward, but also being understanding of their situations and where they are, and not just jumping to, well, why don't you leave? Or why haven't you left yet? Or what's going on, in your situation? It is hard to leave. There are systemic and societal pressures that make it so that people, cannot leave, or that if they leave, it's going to hurt. It's going to be very, very tough. We see that all the time. And, what is the, Christine, you might have the statistic in your head, but it takes, I think, 8 times on average for somebody to leave.
I don't know the actual number, but that sounds like it's probably close to right.
Yeah. It is immensely hard. And just believing someone and acting with compassion can do a whole lot of good.
Well, right. And if you took a person who, for example, is the wife of she's being abused by her husband. She has 4 kids. He hasn't wanted her to work. He's been in control of all the money. If she leaves, how is she supposed to support those children? She doesn't want to leave the children with him because she knows he's abusive. How is she supposed to get out of there? And then you have other people saying, oh, but he's the best. He's blah, 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 such a great guy. He donated all this. He's da-da-da at our church. I mean, how is she ever going to get out of that situation if nobody takes the time to listen to her? And how is she going to do it the first time? She's got to work up to be able to get skills to get a job, get enough strength to feel like she can do it herself, and that she won't be a horrible person if she leaves her husband and takes her children to somewhere safer. So there's places that will tell you, if you leave, then you're a bad mother, you're a bad parent, you're a bad wife, you're a bad person. There's a lot of pressures on that person that make it really, really hard to leave. And I mean, I feel like remembering that when you're deciding, remember that can help not make a snap judgment to just say, well, why did you even stay there?
Right.
Because of reasons you won't understand. Hopefully you'll never have to understand. You'll never as a person have to go through yourself. That's the bottom line. I know the people who understand the best are probably people who have dealt with it, but while I hope people will be empathetic, I hope they never have to truly understand. It's not a place you want to have been in your life.
Right. Right. I mean, I will say, I remember one client who, if there can be a silver lining to a disaster, they were able to take some of the money that they got from a FEMA disbursement, and that was their way out. That was the way that they could finally afford to get a down payment to put on last month's rent and get away. But think of if somebody hadn't believed them, if those social supports weren't in place, they couldn't have left.
Right. No, that's absolutely right.
Is that all you guys have today?
I think so, unless there's questions.
Unfortunately, there's no questions right now, but I wanted to thank you both. I know this is like a very difficult and sensitive topic, so I wanted to thank you for coming on today and spending the time talking about it. It's very important, and I don't think it gets addressed enough in the conjunction with disaster. So I wanted to thank you guys. And also a reminder that this video does not provide legal attorney-client privilege, and that the advice that's been given today doesn't necessarily pertain to your situation, and we may not have talked about defenses that you have. So always seek an attorney or legal help. And for more information, visit www.lsnf.org. Thank you, guys.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.